Welcome to Pleasure Uprising. I'm Dr. Laura Jurgens, intimacy coach, somatic practitioner, and your guide to getting out of your head and into your body, your desire, and your real capacity for connection. This show is for people who are done performing and ready to actually feel it. Let's go. So today I am so excited to bring and welcome Anke Richter, who is an international cult journalist. She's the author of 4 books, including the international bestseller Cult Trip, published by HarperCollins. She's the founder-director of Decult, which is the first cult awareness conference in Australasia. It's an international conference. And she has researched a number of cult dynamics, including neo-tantra cults, Centrepoint, ISTA, OneTaste firsthand. And she's joining us from New Zealand today, which means she's graciously agreed to be here very early in her morning. So welcome, Anke. I'm so glad that you are with us today.
And I'm so glad to be here. Thank you, Laura.
I wonder if we could just talk a little bit about your origin story. So how you got here. How did you end up being the person who investigates sex cults? What was that journey like for you?
To sum up the journey, I was the accidental sex cult tourist who became the accidental cult reporter. So I've been a journalist for 40 years and the last 20 plus years as a foreign correspondent for the German media from New Zealand. So never researched cults before. I hadn't even done any reporting about sexual abuse or high control dynamics of any sort. So I really fell into it, doing very different kind of journalism for most of my life by going to a spiritual festival in Byron Bay in Australia, a neo-tantra festival. And I was hooked in there into this culty organism called ISTA. But what happened there at this neo-tantra festival was also that I met a woman from a former sex and therapy cult here in New Zealand, Centrepoint, which was massive even on a global scale, what happened there. I hadn't heard about it because all this happened before really the internet, and the guru had gone to jail and a lot of children had been abused in that cult. But I met Angie, a former teenager who said she was the commune concubine at Centrepoint. And she told me some of her story, and I thought, wow, this is a book. I'd written 3 books at that stage, and I got a great publisher on board and then went off to basically write the story of the aftermath of this former cult here in New Zealand that had closed down or was shut down by a massive court case in 2000. And I was wondering what had happened to all these families that had lived there and all these children who had been, a lot of them, over a third of them at least, had been sexually abused in the sex cult. And they had manufactured drugs there on the premises, psychedelics that they were taking together with teenagers in group experiments. They were pretty radical. And New Zealand's a small country, and a lot of families, hundreds and hundreds of people lived in this therapy community. And a lot of psychologists from Auckland University flocked there, and it wasn't even such an outlier in the in the community landscape of New Zealand at the time. So I wanted to know what had happened and went out on to research the aftermath. And 2 years into it, I had to actually stop that initial book about Centrepoint because it really messed with me mentally, emotionally, as you probably can imagine. If you go deep into those dynamics, I wasn't prepared for it. The vicarious trauma that I accumulated from talking to so many of those sexual abuse victims, and some of them had never told their story before. And this is actually how I got into the whole cult journalism, because then after stopping that project, which then years later was sort of resurrected in my current book, Cult Trip. But then I started looking into other cults like Agama Yoga in Thailand, which I helped to blow out of the water again. It was all about sexual abuse. And then also another cult here in New Zealand that is still going called Gloria Vale, and it's a fundamentalist Christian cult. Kind of sits at the opposite end of the spectrum of Centrepoint. But what I've found through my research was really how common the dynamics are, but also how focused on sexuality they all are or were, and how big the actually similarities were in terms of the communities and and also how children had suffered in there. So that's become my focus, and now I'm a cult journalist, I guess. But actually, I stopped my journalism to run a conference. Yeah.
Yeah. And then you wrote this book, this really important book, Cult Trip. Can you give us like a brief overview of just the scope of it and who you think really needs to read it?
As far as cut books go, I've read so many myself, and there are many, many great cut books out there. They're either usually handbooks for recovery. I'm the journalist who's come to close. So my book is actually it's gonzo journalism, really, because I go in there and people can follow me trying to piece these pieces of the puzzle together and getting too close to people and actually becoming part of the story at some stage, which I guess is fascinating to read. People find it really hard to put it down. It's also very confronting because of, especially Centrepoint, especially one girl in there in my book, the girl in the caravan. Well, she's now a woman over 50 who never told her story to anybody before, what her life was like being a 10, 11-year-old, being sexually abused and hiding from men in this sex and therapy cult. So it's quite confronting. It's also very personal what I write. I bring myself into the story. And I think it does highlight a lot for people to understand those dynamics and why we have a cult problem, not just in New Zealand, but around the world. And also, I think vicariously through me, people can sort of get closer to these people they might have just thought of as maybe weirdos or just broken or lost. I think I really bring a lot of humanity to people who've come out of cults because they're the heroes in my book. Yeah.
Yeah, there's so many people who've been impacted, and I think a lot of people don't understand the scope and scale of the problem and how common it is and how sort of a slippery slope it is from just sort of curiosity about something to all of a sudden being really entwined and impacted. So that was actually my second question was, there's a lot of confusion about what a cult actually is. There's myths that people carry, and I think some of the myths are pretty universal. And I'm wondering for you, what are the biggest myths that you see your average people who maybe haven't been impacted by a cult carrying? And what's the definition of a cult that actually holds up across your work and your experience?
Yeah, I'm really glad you're asking about the myths. So let's start with that because those are really two different questions, right? And I'm really, as a journalist especially, and now, conference convener, I'm really passionate about changing some of those misconceptions and those narratives. And one of probably the biggest narrative, and I come across it every time I give a public talk or so, is that people think they're not susceptible. Normal people think they would never be in a cult because basically what they're implying is because they're too smart or they have too many friends or they have a good life or, that it's the misconception that only people who are weak and stupid and lost and gullible people end up in cults. And that is actually not true. I mean, look around at some of the big names, from Tom Cruise to Alison Mack to, and I can tell you there's a fantastic former supermodel from LA. His name is Hoyt Richards. I think his documentary series is coming out soon. And I met him at a cult conference in Manchester many years ago. And he was a Princeton graduate when he was one of the first male supermodels in LA, well educated, obviously rich, obviously good looking, obviously, not poor and lost. And he was part of a doomsday cult that almost stripped him of everything. And he later managed to sue them the ground. But he was the one where I really learned this from, like, everyone is susceptible. Don't think it couldn't be you, because the more you think it can't be you, the less you're able to see maybe what you're involved in. So that's one myth. And also a lot more people are involved in something that they don't see as a cult, obviously also for those reasons. And then also because of another myth, people always think they can spot a cult because it will look sinister or satanic, or there'll be just weird stuff happening all the time. And that's not what cults normally feel like. They feel pretty good when you get into one. They don't advertise as cults. They're yoga schools or meditation classes or all sorts of self-improvement groups or religious or spiritual across the board. I've heard of pole dancing cults and vegan cults. And it's not about the content. It's another myth. It's not about the belief system. It's not about the content. It's not whether they're right or wrong in what they believe. It's about the levels of power and control and the leadership and the organization and the groupthink, which brings me to answer your second question, what makes a cult, right? So there's usually a charismatic leader, normally a male, not always. We know of Nicole Dedone and Teal Swan and others who are female cult leaders. There's always a common goal, a common purpose, an ideology, a life-changing thing, a religion, something that binds people, and they think, if everyone would do this, the world would be better. Which also shows you the people who end up in cults are there because they want a better world, because they're idealistic, because they're actually do-gooders, because they do believe in community and so on. So all these best qualities of people that we need in this world are being exploited in cults. Then you have us versus them thinking. This can be quite extreme, and like in Gloriaville, or many fundamentalist doomsday groups as well, that the world outside is evil and everyone's going to be lost or get sick or gets raped or whatever if they leave. And then you have the sort of lesser version of that, just being elitist and arrogant and, just sort of putting yourself at the top of the heap of what's going to change the world, what is really bring forward evolution or people's empowerment or sexual freedom. And so it's a sliding sort of scale from being arrogant, elitist, we're the best, to outright, us versus them, radicalized behavior even, where people would then in the end maybe take up weapons and do something extreme. Then you always have a level of exploitation, and that could be a whole lot of volunteer work, but it could also end up in slave labor. Groupthink, obviously, not being able to question the leaders. And these things, you don't notice them at first. It's not like you step into your first workshop and you see all this. It's often comes much later once you're involved in the organization and you're on staff, or you've gone up, you've climbed up the ranks, you're in the inner circle. It's not always right out there from the outside where you enter a compound, everyone's dressed in blue. I mean, this is Gloriaville here in New Zealand, but people don't really join that group because no one's joined there for decades because it's so obviously a cult, and there's been a lot of coverage. But most cults, and I think this is also really important to know, is that most cults don't look like Gloriaville or like even the sannyasins did back then, all dressed in orange or so. They look normal or more benign, or it's not so easy to spot, or what they do seems normal, from yoga to meditation to self-improvement, giving you the tools to, make more money or have a better relationship or be radically honest. All of that. What's wrong with that? Not in itself, only if it's in the hands of coercive, controlling leaders.
Yeah, absolutely. In the US, Mormonism often comes up in these conversations because it impacts so many people. The sexual control of women in particular is really real.
But with my own experience in ISTA and the neo-tantra world I've seen ISTA especially, and I wonder if other groups are doing that too, really target the ex-Mormons, the ex-evangelicals, those who've come out of fundamentalist Christianity. So ISTA is the International School of Temple Arts. That's a big wankerish name. I'm sure you're going to hear more about them. There will be more exposés, and New York Magazine has done a deep dive into the alleged abuse in there. So they've got a pretty bad reputation these days. I wasn't there for 6 years. I wasn't harmed, but I see them as very critical now. So I want to bring them up in the context of Mormonism and so on, because I know that some of their online marketing, and I also know people who've been in groups who've done ISTA trainings in the US, and they were ex-evangelicals, and some of the ISTA marketing was directly targeted at them, which makes total sense. And this is probably also interesting for you as a women's sexuality coach, because it's very enticing and obviously attractive. If you come out of purity culture, you want to undo all this, all the shackles of that, all the guilt and fear and shame. Guilt, fear, and shame, those three words are the first ones that stuck with me when I got into ISTA. That was the mantra, like, we're undoing guilt, fear, shame, guilt, fear, shame, guilt, fear, shame. So who doesn't want to undo this, especially if they've come out of something, that has suppressed their gender identity and their sexuality sexuality, and especially for women, their sexual empowerment and their desire and all of that. I'm really a bit worried, like, people going from the fire into the frying pan, if they think there's another group out there, especially if it's one with such a track record of abuse and victim blaming and lack of accountability, where they think they can find their healing. And they're very likely to come across sexual predators, because that's often what these spaces attract, or what, if you have sexual predators in the leadership, you might not see this first. You might read all this as, oh, everyone here is so free and liberated, and I can do all these wild things, and it feels amazing. So when you asked about Mormonism, this came straight to my mind, because I don't know enough about the religion itself, but I know they exist on a spectrum from obviously being super fundamentalist to maybe more, dare I say, liberal. But our former Prime Minister here in New Zealand, Jacinda Ardern, comes from a Mormon family and hasn't denounced them. So I think it's possible, obviously, for some people in the Mormon world to still have a foot, at least in a friendly way, with their family without being shunned and ostracized like so many other. But for me personally, and I guess also for you, that link between ex-evangelicals falling into sacred sexuality in a way that's actually not safe and possibly exploiting them, that's what I'm really worried about.
You documented that there seems to be sort of a vulnerability for the ex-evangelicals and some sort of, the pull towards quote unquote sexual liberation in some of these groups. And that's the hook that people are using to pull people in. And then you may not see, as you say, that the leadership is exploitative, or there sexual predators actually leading the organization at first. And that does seem to be a pattern. And we've seen that in the neo-tantra spaces as well, right? So I wonder, walk us through the slippery slope for someone who starts with a seemingly benign introductory weekend kind of thing, right? What does the escalation actually look like?
In ISTA, you mean, yeah?
Yeah, sure. Like an escalation in ISTA, in your experience, or something like a neo-tantra space where you might walk into sort of a introductory experience and then be drawn in over time.
Yeah. And I want to just give a disclaimer here. I think I know there are also neo-tantra schools that don't operate in that way. So this is not a generalization about the neo-tantra scene, because there's some great practice in there. There's some great people in there. There's a lot of good stuff in there. So I don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater, but I think some of the bathwater really needs to be looked at, examined, and then tipped out like big time, right? And I think ISTA probably it probably has the dirtiest bathwater at the moment, at least that we know of. There have been other Tantra schools like Charles Muir, and especially also, let's not forget, the new Tantra, TNT in Holland. I actually did a course with them 1 week, not as a journalist, but as this sort of accidental sex cult tourist, just curious. And I was really quite put off, but they're in the introductory training, and usually the intro things are not as extreme as once you climb up the ranks. But even for someone like me who's done quite a few years of ISTA by then and other sort of neo-tantra and self-development stuff, I was really taken aback. I found a lot of really gross and controlling and confronting and very culty, actually. But as is often the case, you can see the cult in others, but you can't see the cult in your own cult. So that's where I was at. So just taking you through the ISTA experience, I started about, oh my goodness, it must have been 2012, 13 when I had my first training, and it's a week long. So it wasn't an introductory weekend. I mean, they have these festivals in New Zealand and in Australia, and I guess also in other places around the world, or they had them back then, which kind of they are the recruitment funnel really for the ISTA trainings. But then the first workshop you do is actually a week-long training, ISTA level 1. For me, It was actually incredible at the time. It completely blew me away because I didn't have my guards up. I didn't know about the red flags. I didn't know anything about abuse in the tantra world. So I came there completely sort of innocent, just hungry for intensity, experience, I guess sexual liberation, deep connections, really. I think this is more what I was yearning for, was some kind of authenticity with myself and others that I had been lacking here, I guess, after so many years as an immigrant in New Zealand, and maybe some parts of my sort of deep and meaningful German soul weren't really met here. So everyone has an Achilles heel where something can land, right? And I guess that was my Achilles heel at the time, that I was suddenly susceptible to things that wouldn't have landed for me before because they were too esoteric or too woo-woo, or I would have just dismissed them and found them a bit icky or whatever. And then, so there's week-long training. You do a lot of group sharing work in circles. I guess the more you expose yourself emotionally, the better the feedback. You do all these different rituals, from group masturbation, which they call self-pleasuring, to other things, prey and predator, or, basically acting out in a maybe psychodrama or gestalt therapy kind of way, with all the different tools, emotional tools you learn. You act out certain desires or certain dynamics to step into the dark masculine or the light feminine, or all these Jungian archetypes. So it's a grab bag of, Jungian psychology, neo-tantra, gestalt, Esalen type stuff from the human potential movement. And it's quite physical. It looks quite sexual if you would walk into this workshop room and see so many naked people at some point also doing, some really intense physical rituals. But it's not so much, at least that's how it's sold to you. It's not an orgy. It's not a group sex experience. It's all about activating these energies inside you. Oh my God, I really don't want to do a plug for ISTA training, so I'm not going to
But the first week sounds like you were really excited about it. And then I guess what I wonder is, like, and I think you give, that's good to know, right? Because that's an important step in the journey, is that part that really draws you in, that feels really good. There's that workshop high, right? That we've
totally.
You can get from great workshops, you can get from problematic workshops. And it's not necessarily the workshop itself that's problematic, but it's sort of what happens later, right? Like the escalating fees and isolation. And then when resistance starts getting reframed as spiritual deficiency, and when boundaries start being, you start being told that you're not spiritual enough if you have these boundaries, or if you don't want to participate in certain ways, you start getting shamed, right? Even when they're saying that we're deconstructing shame. Well, in order, to deconstruct shame, you have to get rid of your boundaries and things like that, right? I'm guessing that's what happened later. Quick break. If you are listening to this show, something in your intimate life may not be where you want it to be. And if you've been trying to think or talk your way through it and it's not quite working, that's not a you problem. That's just a method problem. I made a free guide to help called Get Out of Your Head, a starter guide to releasing the pressure, shame, and shoulds around intimacy. It has some reflection exercises that go deeper than anything you'll typically find in a freebie, and most people feel something shift after just the first one. So go grab it at laurajurgens.com/guide, and the link is in the show notes.
Well, you're guessing absolutely right. I have a feeling you've done a lot of research on ISTA and these kind of groups, because you're absolutely spot on with what you're naming. But for me, I didn't see that. These dynamics were all there, and they also drew me in. And I know this might sound contradictory, because you'd go, "Oh, why? If there are these kind of dynamics, wouldn't that put you off?" But they come, I think they're like the other side of the coin of the amazing workshop high, and the sense of, I found my people. There's something here. If I keep doing this, my relationship, my life, everything is going to change. It's bringing so much good juju into my life. And this is how it first felt. But then exactly, you're on the trajectory, as you named it, where you do isolate yourself more from the muggles, the normal people out there. Everything kind of seems boring. If you're taking drugs, I guess if you're a heavy drug user, a glass of a beer doesn't really cut it for you anymore, right? So it's exactly that. You're kind of hooked on this intensity. And what you said before, Laura, I think is just really important to understand, that the more you get hooked in about all this and you think you're getting the good stuff, the good juju, the less, of course, you're able to realize where it becomes really problematic for yourself and for others because it's a sunk cost fallacy. You've invested too much, you're too deep in. And also, and even on me, as someone who's not a victim, who's not a survivor of ISTA, who wasn't harmed in there, and still I can totally feel those dynamics of feeling that I've been betrayed my former leaders, I betrayed my former friends, the fear of speaking up. It's taken me a long time to even have a podcast interview like this and name all this so clearly, even to say I wasn't a sex cult. It took me a long time. The loss, the grief about the loss of what you had, and maybe not, even though it's kind of fake and it was all money based, or you had to attend another training to get that, and these friends suddenly weren't there anymore. Once I became a critical voice, or I didn't fit the good ISTA follower climbing the ranks kind of assistant anymore. And still there's a grief about maybe the idea that I had or what I thought was real in terms of what a better world could look like. And so even on that low level of someone who has not been raised in a group, indoctrinated for years, I didn't give up my whole life. ISTA was like a sort of sideshow for me for many years, but a good one at the time, I thought. And even though it never impacted my life as much as it did for, I would say, true cult survivors, I can relate to this sense of grief and loss and confusion about what was real and what wasn't. What was in the indoctrination that I believed in, and that was the carrot that was dangled in front of me, and something that I felt, was it really me? With all these great, amazing feelings, was that really from me, or was it all just like a group sort of hypnosis inflicted on us with certain tools and music and dynamics? And I still haven't worked that out. I don't have the answer to that, but it gives you an idea what happens. And yeah, it gives you an idea, right? How big
What it
was it?
take for you to step away?
Yeah, what it took was actually seeing how they were just damaging themselves publicly. And this all happened, it happened on social media in not that public, but in Tantra Not Trauma, which is like the Me Too platform of the neo-tantra world. And that was a year after Me Too in 2018. So I had just helped to expose Agama yoga in Thailand. So I was also a lot more aware of these kind of dynamics. And I was thinking, wow, if ISTA doesn't clean up its act and teachers stop sleeping with students, and I mean, this is the worst I knew of at that time. I didn't know about the alleged rapes and other things that have happened or seem to have happened over the years. More and more people started talking about ISTA in that context, and especially Baba Dez, or Robert Nichols is his real name. Let's not give him all the honorific and asked questions about him and accused him of how he'd treated them after having sex with him. And then my complete disillusion then started from there, to see how Baba Dez, Robert Nichols, and others, but especially him, were basically gaslighting those women, were victim blaming them, were mocking them, shaming them. I thought, whoa, those are the leaders of a conscious, evolutionary, sex educational, sex positive movement. What the heck? And I just thought, I want to have nothing to do with him really anymore. And then it got even worse than the year after, when one of the sort of top lieutenants in ISTA, Janine, wrote an open letter addressing all these things, and basically whitewashing these actions and saying they were all pioneers, they made mistakes. And yeah, and for me, that kind of sealed the deal. I thought, I don't want, as much as I
No
love a lot of people in
accountability.
there, no accountability. There was just, it really became too conflicting. I also thought, I need to walk my talk. I can't expose other culty organizations and then just still be aligned with one that's got a really
Sure.
dark side, which I didn't see for so long. Okay, and that was the time when I really
Yeah.
pulled back. And it's still, for me, I can really put myself into the shoes of people who find it so hard to lay it all out open when it's their own group. And it's a lot easier. And this is why journalists normally don't write about the stuff they're involved themselves, because it's much easier to see the forest for what it is.
When you're standing outside the forest.
Standing outside the forest, not staying all the trees.
If someone is listening right now, they might be thinking, you might have seen friends going deeper into these kinds of spaces. The hunger underneath is really legitimate, right? We see it.
Absolutely.
I see it in my practice. a lot of people carry so much sexual shame, carry a lot of repressive history, have had trauma, have had just feeling disconnected from your erotic self and genuinely wanting something very legitimate. And there are ways to get those things legitimately, but unfortunately, it's very hard sometimes to see from the outside whether the space you're going into is ultimately part of that slippery slope to exploitation and gaslighting, and or if it's something that's legitimately got a safe solution for you to explore for yourself, where you get to hold your boundaries. And that can be really, what I hear you saying is it can be really, really hard to tell at the outset, especially. And then as you get deeper in, you have investment. So I'm wondering for you, like the playbook and the kind of the consistent mechanism, because you've looked at Centrepoint, Osho, which we haven't talked about yet, but that's a really origin story, at least, here in the United States for neo-tantra, ISTA. Is there with these cults, is there a recognizable playbook for how the spiritual framing gets used to override consent?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm glad you're mentioning Osho, or Bhagwan Sri Rajneesh, as he was called, the Indian mystic who started his commune and cult from Pune in India. And then later, for those in the US, of course, you might remember Rajneeshpuram in Oregon and the documentary Wild White Country that captured that. I also highly recommend watching the documentary Children of the Cult, because that's the missing story of those who were sexually abused there. And read Sarita Carroll's book, In the Shadow of Enlightenment. And again, it added another piece of the puzzle, because when I read her story as a sexually abused child, a young teenager from Rajneeshpuram at the age of 12, sexually active openly with so many men in their 30s, and that was a common pattern there in this commune, and not just that one in the US and Oregon, but across the board in the Osho communes around the world. This really added another piece of the puzzle to my Centrepoint research back then, and the commonalities of what was inflicted on the kids because of, and this is why I'm really glad you bring it up, because of the underlying ideology, which is bad enough if we look at ISTA and those groups that are for adults, but it's really disastrous. It's insidious when it comes to groups where there are families and children involved, because what Osho and other so-called spiritual masters and ideologies have been teaching us all along, and it's still so prevalent in the spiritual and New Age world, is that it's always on you if something bad happens. I mean, law of attraction and all this BS. First of all, you've attracted this. It's sort of the first level of victim blaming. It's always an opportunity. It's a chance to learn. It's a gift from God. It's you almost have to thank your abuser or the person who did or said or did something awful to you. They're giving you this opportunity, not just to learn from it but even in the worst case, to forgive them. So then there's often that level, and that we also see that in a lot of the religious cults. I know there's some glory about, where then victims as young as 9 years old, have to forgive their sexual abuser, because that's what a good Christian does. So you have these different layers of New Age philosophy, Osho ideology, neo-tantra, where it's all about there are no victims, we're all empowered here, we're all adults here, you chose this, it's a gift, it's an opportunity to learn, and then the trajectory over to the fundies, where it's all about forgiveness and also don't rock the boat. You're going to harm the community. You're upsetting our leaders if you make this public, and putting the community above everything else, of course, is what cults do.
Yeah.
Where are the processes for accountability? How do you even have some leverage to go up to someone and say, this really wasn't okay. I don't know what to do about this. I feel awful after we did this exercise a week ago, or this is still sitting on me. And where do you even go if, like in ISTA and other culty groups, you have an agreement? I'm putting air quotes on there because you do this on the first day, I think, as a group agreement in front of everybody. So hello, consent, that you don't gossip, you don't gossip means you don't talk to
Can't
other
tell
people
anybody
about
on
what
the
has happened.
outside.
Right, don't tell anyone, and
Yeah,
even with others within the group, you don't go and talk to them about what really sucks about what the leaders did today and stuff. I've probably broken this rule a lot of times because I was upset about stuff and I compared notes with others and why did they do that? And that's actually against the group rules, so to speak. Don't gossip sounds like a nice, sort of moral tenet, right? Gossip is not normally seen as a positive thing, but they use this to actually stop you from making complaints or to actually get some accountability or to compare notes with others. Because as we
sure.
know, strength in numbers, if you're the one who needs to go to the leader and confront them, it's very different to knowing there's an independent person or there are others in the group and you can just check in with them first and see if they had the same experience. So, gosh, I'm probably all over the place with this, Laura, but I think you've already named it too. There are already so many ideological fallacies, is that the right word, in these teachings that on the one hand, yeah, that can help you to maybe move on from certain grievances or where you're completely stuck in a resentment, or maybe they can show you ways how to process certain emotions in just with yourself first. I mean, it's probably good maybe to first look at what is my stuff, what is the other person's stuff, and what do we still need to work out together, right? That's what my therapist
Yeah, but when they're
did.
used as a pattern of avoiding accountability, or when somebody's, resistance or boundaries get framed as a problem, where if you bring forward a complaint, that means you're acting from wounding or stuck in your victim consciousness or something. So you get blamed, right? So I hear you saying that there's this language that accountability is almost like obfuscated, like there's these like spiritual gymnastics to kind of keep you from ever feeling justified in bringing a complaint, or that you could have some recourse or somebody to even talk to about it that would take your complaint seriously and follow up.
Absolutely. I'm glad that you've probably quoted this from my book I'm writing about the victim
Yeah.
stuff and victim consciousness
Well, I've
because
heard it
I,
actually in other
yeah,
spaces too. It's a
you've
really
heard it really common.
new
Yeah.
age framing of victim blaming and a way to minimize people who are asking for their boundaries to be respected.
Absolutely. And I'm so allergic to the word victim being used as a dirty word almost in those circles. Yeah, it doesn't feel empowering to call yourself a victim. I know that a lot of people prefer the word survivor, but that's also not something that everyone can identify with. And I think we need to just strip the word victim of all this loaded meaning and just see it as this is someone who something bad happened to.
Something
And
bad happened to you,
yeah,
and it doesn't have to
yeah.
carry shame.
And whether what you do with it, whether you're okay, I want to sue the other person to the ground, or I just want to have a conversation with them. I mean, there are choices, of course, how you deal with this, with what happened to you. But the fact that you are a victim of something should never be shamed. It shouldn't be discredited. It shouldn't be something that people spiritually bypass to tell themselves, oh no, I wasn't a victim. Another thing I also want to name, especially with ISTA, is the wheel of consent and the level, because consent trainings are very, very common these days. I attended a 5 day, like a pro, that's what it's called, a wheel of consent training in Byron Bay
With
many
Betty
years
Martin.
later. Yeah, I put that in my book as well. And I once did a big story for a New Zealand magazine here about consent training. So I know they're all over the show in the business world and the film world and the neo-tantra world is almost like they're prerequisite to doing anything these days. And I guess that's a good thing, unless it becomes a fig leaf. I think it does in ISTA, where you learn the wheel of consent and how to say yes and no, state your boundaries, feel them in your body, and then learn to accept a no or to say no, because that's often harder for women, often harder for people who have already had their boundaries crossed, often harder also culturally here in New Zealand for people really like to be nice and not, be rude. And it's a really great thing to learn that. But do you learn all this and do you uncondition yourself from decades of saying yes to everything and being a nice girl? Do you uncondition yourself in half a day on an intense week-long workshop where you then want to get your bangs for your bucks, and then you jump into these intense exercises where you actually don't really have a choice to say yes or no, where you're being paired up with people where you don't have a say whether you feel good about doing a really physical or intimate exercise with someone. So I kind of call bullshit on this
It's like a
consent stuff.
veneer of consent.
It's a
And I
veneer,
actually,
I
I
think.
want to say
Yeah.
The Wheel of Consent by Dr. Betty Martin is actually a really wonderful framework, wonderful
Yeah,
book,
I agree.
but you can use anything in the wrong way. And
Totally.
you could certainly use it to put a veneer of consent on something and then set up all the other frameworks such that people
Exactly.
don't
And
feel
it's,
safe to say no
yeah.
or walk
So I tell,
away or stop things or say, I don't want to work with this person.
sorry, I interrupt you there, but I just want to say exactly, even if it's not intentionally built that way. And I want to, and I give a lot of, even ISTA, I want to give some of these so-called pioneers also some benefit of the doubt. I think some of them, maybe Baba Days, it was just creating. No, I wouldn't give him the benefit of the doubt because I think he really did, he was the kid in the candy shop and he's built the candy shop, yeah. But there are probably other leaders in ISTA and also in other groups out there who are not intentionally, who haven't built a whole system so that they can abuse people or just get to
Yeah,
them
they sort of
sexually.
fell into it over time
Yeah, they
for
fell
the
into,
same
and also the
reasons that,
system. It's yeah, and also you could say it's systematic what happens at ISTA, but maybe because people didn't do their sort of checks on it in the same way that we do it now. They maybe didn't understand what an LGAD is, a large group awareness training, or maybe they did. I'm not sure, and I'm not the person really who can assess that for every group. Obviously, we know Scientology was clearly started as a money-making religion. I mean, that was super intentional, and it's probably true for a lot of groups. And then I guess there are others that kind of develop into something really problematic because some of these things are not nipped in the bud in the beginning, and the group dynamics are not healthy, and therefore there's no criticism, and changes can't be made, and leaders can't be questioned. So with this, I'm just saying all this because I want to get to the veneer of also being trauma informed, because I mean, there's barely a course these days that doesn't say we're trauma informed, and I don't know. I mean, I don't know how many certifications out there who really checks them. What does that actually mean? I mean, I'm glad it's
well, it's
yeah,
just, it's one of the reasons why I don't use that terminology myself, because
yeah,
I see it overused and abused, and it doesn't functionally mean anything
yeah.
anymore. And that actually, if you don't mind me bringing another question right now, I feel like I did a recent episode on sexual polarity teachings. I wrote a Substack on it. The sort of divine feminine framework that's been used as by men, defined by men as a receptive, submissive role. And neo-tantra and all of that stuff seems to me like points on the same line, that there's a wellness industry, a section of the wellness industry, certainly not the whole industry, but a subset that's very profitable, that really profits from women's compliance in particular, and making compliance out to be sacred. And I'm
Oh yeah.
wondering if that framing is consistent with your research, or if there's anything you'd add or push back on about that.
It absolutely tracks, and especially with my own personal experience too, because I'm a good example for that. My gateway drug into all of this, before I even went to this neo-tantra festival in Byron Bay, my gateway drug was David Data. I'm sure you're familiar with David Data and his teachings. One of his books has the provocative title, The Way of the Superior Man, I think, right?
Yep.
And I mean, I cringe now thinking about it, but back in the days where suddenly this was introduced to me and fell on open ears was because I'm a typical stroppy feminist raised in a family where it was all about achievement and not, I mean, I'm lucky that my upbringing wasn't about having to look pretty as a girl and be nice, but more, I mean, still be nice, but it was more about be successful and, go out there and conquer the world kind of stuff, which is good. And at the same time, at some point in my life where there was all this confusion, and I guess my middle years and having started a family and having, being married for so many years, and some kind of, bigger questions around who I am. And there's something really landed there with me with the David Data stuff of the woman who's never really lived her more feminine side. Even that word feminine was just kind of repulsive for me. It sounded like female hygiene products or something. Just sounded too frilly and pink. And I never did ballet as a girl. I was a tomboy, right? So, and I guess I still am. And so there was something, another little Achilles heel where something could land for me. And I guess this is true for a whole generation or two, three of women out there too, who think they are accessing something sacred or something they've maybe missed in their life, how good it feels just to submit or no, surrender. Submit is not a ISTA word so much, it's surrender. How good
Surrender,
it feels to surrender.
submit.
What they mean is submit, exactly. But look, I admit to being a control freak. I'm a high achiever. I get so much done. I'm in overdrive most of the time.
Yeah.
I love to just surrender. Oh
Yeah.
God, yeah.
There's nothing wrong with wanting to surrender or submit or be
Yeah,
submissive. There's really good guardrails in BDSM, in dominant
exactly. That's
submission
different. Yeah.
play, in kink play. There's really intense guardrails for a reason. And these people have stripped those out and then put a spiritual mandate on it and said,
Exactly.
actually, don't have any boundaries or safety around this. Instead of playing with this in a way that could be safely played with erotically, we want you to just, submit to our sexual agenda.
I think it's more complex because it's it's a bit twisted because they do tell you, or you've kind of invited to just explore these different sides and see what they feel like and state your boundaries and go to these edges. It's always all about the edge. And of course, if you push the edge out, that's seen as a positive. But then while they seem kind of progressive also in how they approach gender and they try not to be sort of old school tantra, male, female, but they say, masculine, feminine is all married inside you, and it's not about your actually physical gender expression and all of that. So that all sounds pretty rad and fun and progressive. But then I've experienced myself, I've seen it especially, yeah, with male teachers, obviously, they kind of subtly shame you for being too masculine as a woman. And I'm
Mhm.
quite if you think in those stereotypes, I'm probably quite masculine in lots of ways. And I don't even want to use those terms anymore when it comes to these character traits or behaviors, or whatever you want to call it, because I find them, yeah, I've really started to question that again once I've, looked behind so once the veil of all this
Yeah,
is
they all map
open.
onto gender stereotypes. So it's really important to notice that. But what you're saying is that they subtly shame you for exhibiting leadership traits or having sort of
Mhm.
like clarity of purpose and
Yeah.
those types of traits that they're associating as masculine.
And you also see what's being modeled, and you see
Mhm.
these sort of goddesses. There's another word that gets thrown around a lot. You see these goddesses there on their little pedestals of temple priestesses or part of the leading faculty, and they all wear certain type of clothes that are all very feminine and show their breasts and their hips and soft and hugging. And I mean, the guys usually wear soft hugging clothes too, but there's a certain those stereotypes
Reinforce.
move and how they sway their hips and how they talk and the softness and the gaze. And so even though they might not teach you that directly, like you should be a submissive, soft female, gazing at your man like that, but then you see modeled by these cool people around you that seem to have these amazing lives and sex lives and are so evolved. So I think this is also a bit of
Yeah.
the mind fuck which I'm still also trying to undo, I guess, to some degree. Like, what are real teachings here? Where can I check them? What's actually true Tantra or not? And does Tantra make sense? And what's just sort of is this stuff? What's just a
Yeah.
cult, that's been created where you then believe this is the way to be. And you
Yeah.
can also see this, just to bring this up quickly, with the drama triangle of victim, perpetrator, rescue, where a lot of concepts that already exist out there in psychology or spirituality or so, that kind of get misappropriated or twisted in a way. And people who haven't necessarily studied psychology and don't know any better, they take on these concepts, they take on the language, they run around with these kind of frameworks, and it just, wow, it scares me sometimes. I think, oh, this is
Yeah,
how
it's a
they analyze
legitimizing
everything.
tactic in a
Oof,
lot of
yeah,
ways too, just like
yeah.
appropriating science terms, appropriating
Hmm.
Sanskrit words to make you sound
Yeah.
spiritual, appropriating Indian culture, appropriating, we appropriate psychology and then use that in a pop psychology way as well. And so um, that seems to be pretty prevalent too. And I know you've
Oh,
talked
yeah.
about some of those things. So unfortunately, we're running out of time, but I could talk to you about this all day. For someone who is listening to this and wanting to know more, I am going to put a few links in the show notes for everybody for some great resources on red flags and in workshops. But what would you say? How do people find you? How can people continue to learn?
Right. People can find me on ankerichter.net. And if they want to learn more about the conference I'm organizing and which will be live streamed around the world, go to decult.net.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. It was absolutely my pleasure to have you on.
And I really love that you've tackled this with me. Thank you so much, Laura, and thanks for your good work.
Hey, before you go, if you enjoyed this show, I want to invite you to check out one of my favorite things that I've ever created. It's a free guide called Get Out of Your Head, a starter guide to releasing the pressure, shame, and shoulds around intimacy. It has 4 reflection exercises that go deeper than anything you'll find in a typical freebie, and most people feel a shift just after part 1. So go grab it at laurajergens.com/guide. The link is in the show notes. And if you're ready to find out what your specific path looks like, I'd love to talk to you. Booking info is also in the show notes, and I will see you here next week.